Hello, Africa and beyond. You're welcome to Talking Point, where we tackle the pressing issues shaping the African continent and world today. Today, we shall delve into a topic that strikes at the very heart of Africa's progress and sovereignty: neocolonialism on the African continent, how to end mental slavery. It's been 6 years or so after Africans took back their continent from colonial masters. Though some countries on the African continent are in control of the national affairs, a few African nations have broken the poverty shackles or found the elixir of world creation. Seychelles, Mauritius and Botswana being the countries that have bunked the trend. Like most fathers of Pan-Africanism, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah did say, "Obtain ye first political freedom, independence, and other things shall be added." This saying has not come to pass as far as the African continent is concerned. The Atlantic slave trade, colonialism or colonization, post-independence, neocolonialization, military interventions across the African continent, the Cold War and world economic order are some of the reasons given for this state of affairs. While mental slavery is not just a political or economic issue, it is a battle of the mind, a struggle to reclaim Africa's narrative, dignity and future. How do the continents break free from the chains of this subtle yet pervasive form of control? What steps must be taken to end mental slavery and pave the way forward for true independence? Join us this day as we thought leaders, intellects and activists across the African continent and beyond. We shall be dedicating today's edition of Talking Point in a bid to understand and confront these challenges that are plaguing the African continent. Today we shall explore bold ideas and actionable solutions to dismantling the remnants of neocolonialism and reclaiming Africa's identity as well as destiny. This is the conversation and it starts now. This is Talking Point. Stay with us. It's a new day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Point of our Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Well, today we shall be, dismantling today's topic of discussion that focuses on neocolonialism on the African continent. We're asking the question, how can Africa end mental slavery? It's worth noting that mental slavery takes numerous forms amidst their aids and others, including education and others. So we shall be discussing this with our guests this day in a bit to comprehend further at this topic of discussion. To kickstart our opening our panel of experts this day, I'm first of all joined all the way here from Cameroon by Chief MUSI in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist. Greetings to Your Majesty for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharon, for always having us on For You Media. It's my privilege to be here today to talk on the topic of today.
Exactly, and some of these topics do edify the African continent, the population, in charting the way forward for Africa's destiny. Equally, another Pan-Africanist is joining us this day, but he's more than a Pan-Africanist as he's joining us equally in his capacity as an economist and a fintech expert. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for taking our time to be with us this day.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and also thank my co-panelist, Chief, for joining as well, and I hope we have a fruitful conversation today.
Looking forward to fruitful conversations. Meanwhile, to kickstart today's conversation, I would like to debate with you, Chief MUSI. Now, being a Pan-Africanist, you are equally a traditional authority. Looking at this idea or ideology of mental slavery that has been at the center of the conversation in Africa for a very long time, we're discussing neocolonialism, which happens to be, the era in which Africa finds itself at this particular point in time. Given this era, how would you define mental slavery in this particular context, especially as Africa is still striving, to attain true independence?
Well, I'll look at it more from the perspective of where we are today in Africa. Say 50, 60 years ago, we were not here. And it was just normal that at the time of colonialism, our colonial masters shipped most of Africans to the West, and they lived their life. They have used our people to develop the Western world. And of course, today we are at the verge of asking questions. There's a new breed of Africans that have come up, and these questions are now coming up. And looking at the topic which we are having today on neocolonialism, we are now looking at what actually did the West do to Africans, that today you see most African nations are backing off and contesting and, you know, denying the pressure that has been put on them. And I would think that the topic today is a very sensitive one, because if you look at the trend of events across Africa as we speak, you realize that there is a breed of young people who have taken over leadership. And most of these young people range between the age of 35 to 50, 60 years. And this is exactly the period when colonialism, when they started, when our colonial masters started. You know, so if you look at this, these are people who were born at that time. Most of these leaders were born around that era. And I'm sure they have grown of age, and they think it is the right time for us to look at what we have that we keep going back to the West to ask for. And what is it that the West has also gained from us that we think it is the right time for us to ask it, that they should give it back to us? This topic today of neocolonialism, it's kind of a mental slavery thing where most of us Africans, they have shipped us, they have used our knowledge, they have used our raw materials and bettered themselves. And today they think that it has to continue, but this is not the time. Most African leaders have sat up and they are now thinking, they are now asking that the West has to withdraw from what we have and do business with Africa as it's supposed to be. So I think this topic today will be x-raying most of these ideas and seeing how we can make Africa better again. And I think this is the right time, and we'll keep sharing these ideas as we go on this program.
Thank you immensely, Chief. Now to proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD, you're equally an economist, like I mentioned, during the introduction. You listened to your co-panelists and the point he elaborated on. Looking at economic independence on the African continent, how would you say, how does Africa's economic reliance on foreign aid, external trade systems continue to perpetrate neocolonialism within the context of the African continent?
I think that the person who brilliantly stated this in 1965 would be Kwame Nkrumah, who actually even made the term neocolonialism as popular as it is. In his book, The Last Stage of Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, he talks about this particular issue on economic dependence. And the idea was, if you're going to basically have a continent, by that time he was not even talking about any independent state on the continent of Africa. He was basically stating that if you were going to have a whole entire continent dependent economically on former imperialistic power, that basically means the same control that was exerted during the period of colonialism will continue, because economic dependence is far more important than anything else, which is basically supposed to be the very first step of liberation. If you cannot liberate people on economic terms, you are still holding them with the barrel of a gun. It might not be an AK-47. It might just be their GDP. It might be, their structural developments. It might be issues that has to do with, education. All of this was basically what Kwame Nkrumah was, pushing at. So we've come to a place in time where we have to be able to find ways in which we free ourselves, especially on the economic front. And what is fascinating is that since we have been taught in many ways about what to plant, how to plant it, when to plant it, we have been taught that our lands, especially on the continent of Africa, can only do so much and it's only good for so much, yet we are actually custodians of 60% of the world arable land. That in itself is an insult, not just to our ancestors, but it's an insult to us as well. So the question becomes, when we're talking about neocolonialism, who are you pointing the accusation using finger two. I mean, at what point in time will Africans basically step up and say, you know what, we're going to basically take our own destiny into our own hands? We are sitting on the land. We are absolutely custodians of the land. And so we have to start thinking critically, especially when it comes to how we do things and why we do it. I think neocolonialism, its tentacles on the continent of Africa is still as powerful as it's been, primarily because of the type of leadership we have on the continent. And except we begin to think a little bit differently about our leadership, we will never be able to achieve economic dependence. We will never be able to talk about having a continent that basically, strive and have the capacity to be able to compete with the rest of the world, especially within the 21st century economy.
And that is true. And like you mentioned, it's all in line with, some of the parameters that do exist on the African continent. Look at, for instance, cultural influence. You see that these external parties do have a hold on numerous factors across the African continent. And that will lead me to, the next question, Chief MUSI. Now, I mentioned earlier that you are a traditional authority, and I would like to capitalize on that, given I want to evoke this issue of culture in Africa. How has the infiltration of foreign cultures within this sphere of the African continent, and these ideals influence African identity and gone a long way in fueling mental slavery on the African people?
First, it's the coming of Christianity, because we had our African tradition, we had our culture that we respected so much. So when Christianity came, it came with its own things that actually tried to jeopardize our culture. But if we drift a little bit away from it and still acknowledge the fact that we traditional rulers, we still have control over our masses, we still have control over our people, it gives us the latitude to understand that in as much as our people still pay allegiance to us, we have a culture. And this culture has to be respected. And if you look at the way the West came in, they came in with administration, they came in with politics, and they also came in with capitalism, where they tried at all costs to take away the powers of our tradition, the powers of our traditional rulers by involving them into politics, so much so that they can be derailed to suit the Western mentality. But that has not been the case, because we still emphasize as traditional ruler on the beliefs that we have with our people and in respect to our ancestors. And looking at the aspect of mental slavery in terms of our culture, we have been able to safeguard our tradition, whereby when the West invites Africans to their country, they try as much as possible to organize cultural events whereby they tend to see how they can actually change some aspects of our tradition. But what they fail to understand is that when we move with our culture to the West, we usually do not go along with the originality of the culture, because our culture still remains our homeland. So what I would say here is that mental slavery in Africa started with the fact that I think in 1957, the Western world held a treaty in Paris where they talked about neocolonialism to look at the way in which they could assimilate Africa. And by assimilating Africa meant they could give us free loan policies. They could they could use our leaders and enrich those leaders, so much so that the leaders now come and implement their Western policies to our people. But this is the right time where the younger generation is coming up. The younger people are coming up to say, listen, we have a culture as Africans. And as Africans, the time has gone that all our raw material that was taken away from Africa, they have to be compensated for. So I think at this level, we as traditional rulers, we are we continuously tell our indigents, we continue to tell our people that it is time we hold very strong to our cultures, because there is this aspect where our governments have also tried to use the law to implement or bring in to bring in fractions within our traditional leadership by, setting our traditional ladder in chiefdoms, where you have first class, second class, and third class chiefdoms. This law was passed in 1977, and that was still another act of neocolonialism, because they were trying to see who were the strongest culturalists, who were the strongest traditional rulers, and classify them. And by so doing, they try to use those fondoms that have the first class fondom to be able to assimilate or to transmit some information that they would want transmitted to our grassroots. So, but I think we have, and we still hold very strong to our culture in this present world, because if you look at how our people still pay allegiance to us, it's not the same way they respect our leaders. Call it the politicians, call it the people, the ruling governments. And one thing which I still hold very strong, that I think we need to be very serious as Pan-Africanists, is the fact that it has come a time where most of those treaties that were signed with African nations have expired, and it needs renewal. And in the renewal phase of these treaties, a lot has to be fixed, and they will not continue to tap away our raw material to enrich their governments and then bring it back to us and sell it as loans and give it to us as subventions or economic aid. Call it whatever name you want to call it. But I think we are on the right path, because our culture still remains unique.
Indeed, Africa's culture remains unique, and it is more than ever, the call for Africa to reclaim its identity, to reclaim its stance as far as all this is concerned. Now, Dr. FONGOD, many times there have been, this call for Africa to be able to revamp its education system, which is what we see in this present day, and of course is what noting that there's this call for Africa to change its modus operandi it admits the present context, where we see that Africa's context is so rooted in colonial legacies. With that said, how can Africa, go a long way in decolonizing some of these, systems, especially within the education sector, so it gets to reflect what Africa wants and promote self-reliance?
I think that we have to come to this place where we have somewhat of an education, or better still, a cultural renaissance. I think time has come for us to be able to promote indigenous knowledge and values. If we are not going to be able to do so, I think Chief was, primarily talking about the onset of Christianity, or maybe the onslaught of Eurocentric Christianity on the continent of Africa, which in more ways really was not even a representation of Christianity at all. I think that one of the things that we need to do on the continent of Africa is to fully understand first century Christianity. If you do not understand first century Christianity, it is not possible for you to understand Christianity at all, because the version of Christianity we have now is Eurocentric. It was manufactured in Europe, cooked up in Europe, laced with traditions and values from Europe, which has nothing to do with the Judeo-Christian worldview so far as the first century, second century, and maybe a little bit of the third century is concerned. Most of the scholars who basically formulated the doctrine so far as Christianity were concerned was actually not Africans in the place called Alexandria in Egypt. So there has been a thriving Christian presence on the continent of Africa long before Europe even knew who, Yeshua HaMashiach was, the man they later named Jesus, as of the 14th, 15th century. The ideas that, we just have to carry hook, like, and sinker whatever has been pushed out of Europe in the name of Christianity itself is antithesis to who we are in relationship to our culture. So we really must be able to make sure that we revitalize, our African traditions and values and language and philosophy, all right, and find ways in which we can maybe foster a little bit of resilience and pride and self-determination in who we are as a people. You're talking about us reforming our educational system. I think that there has to be a way in which we design curriculum on the African continent that basically focuses on African history. The reason why this is important is not because, someone is going to basically compete in the 21st century if all they know is African history. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this: if you do not know where you're coming from, if you have no idea just how potent your past has been and how powerful your abilities are, which is locked up within the DNA that you carry from our ancestors who did great things, you will always be psychologically handicapped. You will look like someone who has some kind of a mental leprosy, all right? You will be segregated to a corner where nobody really wants to talk to you because you have no dignity, no self-pride. You just move around like a rabbit waiting to be eaten. You have to be able to pick up yourself and say, you know what, this is who I am. I am coming from royalty. I'm coming from a people who were warriors. I'm coming from a people who fought off invaders off of the shores of Africa to preserve their story, our story as Africans. They fought not just for themselves, but they fought for us as well. And so once the story of the African, it's basically enshrined within our educational system, then you're talking to a young African who fully understand, okay, what it means to have loyalty to country. All right, if you look within the context of the United States today, we have a leader like Donald Trump who basically speaks of America first. America first, America first. Every single thing is all about America so far as Donald Trump is concerned. And I see absolutely nothing wrong with that. The question is, why not Africa first? Why not Africa first? When you have leaders on the continent of Africa that are given, to basically looting and flying out of the continent of Africa to go and do their investments, somewhere else, not on the continent of Africa, that basically tells you that we do not just have a problem. We have Neanderthals, okay? They are not humans. They are not Homo sapiens. It's an extinct species of human beings, Neanderthals. These are the men we have that we call leaders. I have, and beside that, I have zero respect for men like that. I think the continent in itself needs to be able to wake up. Even if the educational system is not changing, I hope that what we are doing on this platform will basically help someone begin to do their own research to fully understand their historical past. And believe me, that past is great.
The past is great indeed, and of course the future is brighter for Africa. Now, Chief MUSI, picking up from where your co-panelists stopped as far as, pitching this idea of Africa first on the African continent, there is equally this idea of mental slavery at the level of languages. And like I'll reiterate once again, in your capacity as a Pan-Africanist, when you look at languages, for instance, let's take an example like Cameroon that has, over 200 ethnic groups. With the African continent, we have different languages. There is English, there is French, there is Portuguese, there are different languages. We equally have countries that are still rooted in their cultural languages like Zulu, there are languages even in Cameroon, in Central Africa, West Africa, and you name the rest. With that said, how does this dominance of, these colonial languages over indigenous languages on the African continent affect this issue of African unity and as well mental liberation?
I'll even take a simple example of my little son, who was born in the city. He grew up in the city, and rarely, he only goes to the village once in a while. It's only now that we're pushing our children to go back home and learn the dialect, because even the English that we speak, it's a borrowed language. The French that we speak is a borrowed language.
True.
And French was colonized by the French. Cameroon was colonized by the French. And if you look at our language, French, you would realize that Cameroon speaks French, and their official languages, English and French. And these are all borrowed languages. What happens to the Pinyin dialect? What happens to Lamso? What happens to, the Fufube? What happens to the Hausa? So I think it has really affected our cultures. The issue of the languages that we speak in our country, in Africa, that's affected us a lot, in the sense that we tend to speak someone's language, learn it in school, and even teach our own children. But like I keep saying, as a Pan-Africanist, the trend is changing, because we are now coming out with the Bible, which is, I put it in quote, the Bible, in our different languages. We are coming up with songs. We are coming up with alphabet in our different languages. I think these are some of the things. These are the things we need to encourage. If each village has its alphabet, and we encourage, I think Dr. FONGOD said something, that we need to start teaching our culture. We need to start teaching African history to our children, add it to our curriculum, than just studying war history, fishing in Norway. It doesn't make sense. So I think this is the right time we sit up as Africans and start including in our curriculum our own mother tongue. We teach our own mother tongue. And in time to come, as we are propagating for a united Africa, that time will come where, as Africans, we will choose if we want to study, if we want to speak which of the languages. Do we want to speak Swahili? Do we want to speak Fufube? Do we want to speak Zulu? So we will have to agree as Africans which language we want to be better identified by. But I think we have said it time and in number that Africans must try as much as possible to propagate for a united Africa, so that we can continuously preserve our cultural values, to the extent where the Western world will one day turn and come back to Africa for whatever support they want. Because yes, it's true, they have been taking away the raw material from Africa, but it's never going to get finished because we own the raw materials. I watched a movie, Black Panther. I watched a movie, Black Panther, and if you look at the movie, it has a real interpretation of what Africa is. Like you see, they're talking about the diamond, they're talking about diamond that they're transporting in Africa. And in the movie, they tell you that if they stole diamond from Africa, it's just a little piece of diamond. The real diamond is still there. So our leaders have the prerogative to safeguard our national integrity. They have the right to safeguard our cultural policies, our values, and as well as the respect that the West needs to get from us Africans. So I think we are just at the verge of having the right rulers across Africa. And there will come that day, come that time where Africans appreciate the fact that we now have the kind of rulers who know what the Thomas Sankaras needed, who knows what the Gaddafis needed. And this is the time. And I laugh often when I heard one of my friends told me, there will come a day that many of such people will come back and work as our own house help. Because yes, we have been transporting our knowledge to the West. We have had mental slavery, but that time is coming where we will still have to sit back again and re-examine and go back to the drawing board and give value to Africa, and we will be proud again when that time comes.
Indeed, Africa would be proud again. And of course, that's what Africa is on this part of change. And it's time. This is a clarion call for all the leaders to leverage the resources, to leverage the intellect, teach the values of the African people to the African young generation, of course, because they are the future of today and they are the future of tomorrow. Now, we just got indications that Shitu Farawa has joined us in his capacity as a digital news editor, who's joined us all the way from Lagos. And you just came in at the right and perfect timing. Now, Shitu, good afternoon. I'll just, add up to what your panelists have been saying so far. And now we've been citing points through which we're seeing, different forms of mental slavery across the African continent and how Africa can move past, some of these challenges to paint the future that it intends to have for itself. With that said, there is this role and that the media do have a very powerful role in society. But it's equally said in Africa that no one can tell the African story than Africans themselves. How is the global media shaped Africa's image, and what is the role that, African-based media, representative media organs can play in reshaping the continents that the ones, in reshaping the narrative, the true narrative of the African continent in a way to eradicate these forms of mental slavery? Ashito, please, could you unmute your mic?
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
essentially, you have a scenario where the story of the hunted is being told by the hunter. It will always be biased towards the hunter. We have all the tools it takes for us to reposition Africa, to tell the African story, tell the African narrative. But we seem to continue to ape what the West is doing, and that is a very problematic issue. About how we are perceived and how we project ourselves, because nobody can blow your trumpet better than you do. So it is up to us to, ensure that our real identity, our, the wholeness, the completeness, the African pride is projected in the things we do, in our programming, in our storytelling, our narratives, our novel writing, whatever it is. We must project Africa in good light or in better light, so that we ourselves be proud of ourselves. Because one of the reasons why a lot of Africans do not think in the African, with the African mindset, is because they have been brainwashed. They have been used to a certain worldview that is punctuated by Western, perspectives. However, we have our own traditional approach to issues. We have our Afrocentric approach to issues. And so we must lionize, we must promote issues that, project us in better light. Because if we continue to compete with the white man in his own turf, we will continue to struggle, But if we look at things and we domesticate it, for example, if you are trying to teach an African child a concept, before he gets to understand English, there's already particular language, within his environment. Why can't we domesticate knowledge into the form where he can understand that knowledge from his immediate, environment? The English boy or the French boy does not need to learn another language before he receives knowledge. A lot of Arabs don't need to understand English, or French in order to receive knowledge. So why are Africans having to, the African Fulani boy, or the African girl having to learn English first and then understand concept, in the foreign language? So while, the English language or the French language are international language for which, for trade, international currency and usage is there, we must figure out how to learn from our own local perspectives, our own native background, such ways that we can think in an Afrocentric way. In that way, we can begin to tell our narratives more appropriate through, media, through, literature, through play and all that. So that's it about that.
Indeed, it's time for Africa to be creative, to tell its own story. I'll be staying with you, Shitu. You mentioned something about currency, and of course, you mentioned that it's in Africa's place to be able to, define the part it intends to have. Most countries, as we speak at this particular point, are still rooted in that. Now, this is because, they are reliant on aid coming from external creditors, and this go a long way in impeding, progress in their respective countries. Now, Dr. Fongod earlier on mentioned and asked a very, very provocative question, a question on why is it, or why do we not have this concept of Africa first, you know, shining so bright on the African continent? I'd like to capitalize on that. How, or why would you, in your perspective, why do you think Africa is not yet at this point, and what needs to be done to get to that point where Africa can be able to, you know, discard everything that is irrelevant in quotes and prioritize just what will lead to its progress?
Yeah, so basically it has to do with education. You see, you know, there's this thing about you putting your funding that which enables you, put your money where your mouth is. If people do not have the capacity to think African, if you do not have the capacity or you know, the improvement, the understanding that they need to think with an African mindset, they will continue to think from the Western mindset, the Eastern mindset, the non-African perspective. And so everything they do will be towards, you know, externality as against internality. So one, investment in education. You will realize that in most countries on the continent, there is little investment in education. And it is education that drives the thinking capacity. I call it, you know, the mental resources. The mental resources will engineer growth, engineer development, and engineer anything we need to do to push ourselves forward. So for us to stand at par with our, you know, peers across the world, we must have the mental readiness, the education, the knowledge, and this knowledge will rely on investment. How much do African countries invest? Look at the budgets of Ghana, look at the budget of Nigeria, look at the budget of Kenya, for example, and see how much, you know, we budget on education. It is very low, lower than the globally accepted standards. So for any country or for any continent that seeks to push its own narrative forward, it must find a way around funding the quality of education. Only then I'll begin to say that, okay, this type of education is functional, this type is strategic, this one is useful, this one is outmoded, and therefore we'll pick from the types of education or the types of learning that will put us ahead of our peers, or that will put us at par with our peers, because we need to be at least at par or ahead than to be second fiddle to those from whom we continue to seek aid and development.
Indeed, Shitu, now I'll be getting back to you, Dr. Fongod. Now, you listen to your co-panelists, and we're picking up from there. Now, given the context of the African continent, I was reading an article, or better still, a paper a couple of days ago that stated the impact, you know, international developments, agreements, partnerships, or better still, corporations do have through, you know, how these external parties do hold a grip on the African continent through some of those partnerships. Now, being an economist, we've seen, you know how powerful global trade and exploitation can be, especially, you know, in the countries that are the receiving end. Now, do you believe that international trade agreements, which do exist with some African countries or nearly most African countries, and the exploitation of Africa's natural resources, like cited your co-panelist Chief MUSI earlier when he stated that Africa do have resources, it has the resources, but it is time for Africa to be able to leverage some of these resources to harness its own growth. Now, do you believe that some of these, you know, these agreements, these attempts to exploit Africa's natural resources are still forms or modern tools of neocolonialism in this context of Africa?
You just mentioned two things. Number one, we are talking about trade policies. And if you're going to talk about trade policies, that's one. And then if you're also going to mention the exploitation of natural resources, I'll probably put that in the separate quadrant. The reason for that is because when we look at trade policies on the continent of Africa, the reality is that it is absolutely unfair. We can't even compete. You see, the only way for us to actually compete and have anything that is fair, besides tariffs, besides, you know, all those high taxes, it's the fact that we must be able to fight subsidies in Western markets. So think about it this way. If you basically say that you're trying to be able to trade with, let's say, France or you're trying to trade with Switzerland, and you are an African country, let's say Nigeria is trying to trade with Switzerland, and they want to trade with a particular product, let's say something like rice, for example. Now, if the rice that is being produced in Switzerland, if they were producing rice, is heavily subsidized, that simply means the government gives their farmers a lot of money, gives them all these perks and every single thing else. What will happen eventually is that the cost of production for the rice out of Switzerland will be so low that those farmers in Switzerland will be able to sell their products way cheaper than those that are being farmed in Nigeria. And if you were going to talk about free trade, that in itself will be free, but it will not be fair trade. And the reason is because the Nigerian farmer will never be able to sell anything anywhere else, not even in Europe. And the reason for that is because their products are just too high, and eventually the Nigerian farmer will basically completely leave the field altogether, will no longer farm rice. Reasons being, whatever is imported out of Europe it's so cheap, and it is just quite enticing to the local market. This is what is happening so far as something like flour is concerned in areas like Senegal. We have to be able to make sure that by the time we start talking about trade or whatever trade policy, it has to be fair trade, which means if we are going to deceive ourselves and go sign conventions we know nothing about, just sit for there, and then they bring a piece of paper, you say, oh yeah, we're going to permit you to sell your products in our market. That makes no sense. That's trash. The reason is because you don't understand the market, you don't understand exactly what the host country is doing, you have no idea how the systems run, you don't know about the tremendous advantage that they give to their farmers, especially in subsidies. I'm just talking about this using farming as an example, the agricultural sector as an example. So we have to be able to understand fully what is going on so far as trade is concerned. Free trade means nothing. Okay, signing trade policies means nothing, except that trade policy is based on fair trade. If it's not based on fair trade, it means absolutely nothing. Secondly, I think that we have to find ways in which we help the continent of Africa just deliver Africa. I mean, there used to be this African prophet called TB Joshua, who basically built his ministry on the aspect of deliverance. That word became quite synonymous with him, deliverance. So maybe somebody needs to wake TB Joshua up to deliver this continent from the World Bank and to deliver Africa from IMF, all right? The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Africa needs tremendous level of deliverance so far as these two institutions is concerned. The only alternative that we have on the continent is the African Development Bank. That should be something that we pursue intently. And the reason for that is because if we build up the African Development Bank to be what it's supposed to be, then we will actually have a lot of investors that are coming in from outside using the African Development Bank as a stage for them to be able to invest in the continent. All right. So on the continent of Africa will basically have a lot of other people coming so that they can be able to put their money to work for them on the continent of Africa. The moment you have IMF and you have the World Bank, the problem is these institutions are so enshrined within the colonial mindset, all right? And so we are talking about neocolonialism. The IMF and the World Bank are basically arms of neocolonialism. So on the continent of Africa, they are absolutely not helping us no matter what. And that simply means we will now have to be able to reduce our dependency on funding that is coming from outside of the country and find ways in which we can organically develop the kind of funding we need for projects on the continent of Africa. I think that if we can do that, we will now have individuals coming from outside of the continent that will be able to say, African Development Bank, here's $1 billion. I'm trying to be able to invest in anything that has to do with agriculture. Here's $1 billion. I'm trying to invest in anything that has to do with the tech sector. Here's $1 billion. I'm trying to be able to invest in anything that has to do with infrastructural development. Individuals will have to come from outside to be able to help us achieve this, plus those within the continent to be able to help us achieve this. But the idea that we have to continue going to the World Bank and IMF, so far as I'm concerned, does not really push our agenda forward.
Now, you mentioned the issue of the, dependence on external entities like the World Bank, the IMF, and so on and so forth. But what about the exploitation of resources on the African continent?
Well, and that's where part of the pain that I have with the Western media is that, especially Western media run by Democrats, people who left-leaning lunatics, people that just absolutely have no two functioning brain cells of their own, not because they're dumb. It is because it's all a game. Channels that are pro-liberals will tell you about Africa in light of whatever pushes their agenda so far as racism is concerned. That simply means they will call out racism that's happening in Africa. They will say, look at what's happening in this particular area. Look at these poor people on the continent of Africa. But yet they are the same people collecting money for advertising from companies that are basically decimating the continent, especially in the sector of mining. If you look at places like Congo, Nigeria, Cameroon, East Cameroon, you can see what unregulated mining is doing to the environment. We are basically, being decimated. We are totally wiping out, whole areas, making it absolutely unsuitable, for humans to even live in. And because we have this very aggressive practices that we do so far as mining is concerned, and yet the Western world and the Western media knows about it, but you cannot report that because that goes against the narrative, and that's the problem that we have. What I think is, why don't we just forget about mining? We can forget about mining for a second. What that means is this: if we're going to mine, it has to be heavily regulated, number one. Number two, and we can basically just go to vast areas and do geological studies in those areas and basically say, we know exactly what the cluster abundance of gold is in this particular area. We know how many metric tons of gold that this place can produce because we can see it based upon our instruments. So we know just how rich this land is. We take that particular document and then use that as a financial instrument to be able to get the money that we need, especially for infrastructure development, or use that and trade and just use it as a financial instrument and trade that, in the market. We can do that. Unfortunately, because we are not really thinking, and we have people who basically knows exactly, how rich certain areas of their countries are, and they have their friends and family members mining aggressively so that they can loot as much as they can before the status quo changes. That's where we are. But I think that the whole entire stuff about mining, long before we start, pointing accusing fingers of these Western corporations that comes in and then carry every single thing else, we basically need to start asking ourselves the question, who is running these countries? Because believe me, those are the people who are responsible for the badness that we are receiving.
Indeed, Dr. FONGOD. Now, moving on to you, Chief MUSI. You mentioned earlier in your previous response that it begins with leadership, change begins with leadership on the African continent. And of course, there is this need for political will, the willpower for this change to actually come into, into existence. Now, how, with this issue of leadership on the African continent, when we're looking at how to change, things across Africa, what leadership qualities actually are needed for Africa to be able to break the chain of this issue of mental slavery, breaking free from the bondage, and of course taking the continent forward?
Let me take. We've said it on this channel several times that if you look at the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, the Sahel area, you will understand what kind of leadership we are talking about. Just take a simple example. That is the president of Burkina Faso. He refuses his presidential salary. He goes on his salary as a captain. He refuses all extra amenities that are added on his salary. He refuses all those things. Those are the things that African leaders need to emulate. They need to copy that example from Traoré. And I think with the coming of all these other African leaders, I tell you, we will say this today, tomorrow, and even after tomorrow. There is a complete wave blowing across Africa. Believe me. Subsequent elections in Africa, you would see the change. You would see the change in leadership. You would see the change in mentality. And I want to ascertain to you that if we want to have the kind of leaders, we have to go back to the drawing board, because our leaders spend exorbitant sums of money in running their different offices. I'm talking about our leaders, from the presidents, of the directors, generals, and the ministers and all of that. The members of the Senate, the senators, the members of parliament, they spend exorbitant sums of money in terms of saying they are ruling the country. When they sit in the parliament, when they sit in the Senate, they consume huge sums of money adopting something that has already been adopted. So I think it is time we start looking at the examples of some of these African leaders who are taking over what belongs to them, and asking the West that you have to pay for it. You have to do business. I think the point is very clear. We are not refusing that the West should not come into Africa. We have to be very clear each time we go on the air. We are saying that if they have to come into Africa, they need to come and sit on the table and negotiate with us on a win-win basis. I think that is where we are heading to. And all of this neocolonialism started because the West actually sat and agreed in 1957 that they wanted to continuously stay at the helm of colonizing Africa. That was the reason why they started neocolonialism. And they decided it, and they used our own people, our own leaders, our own presidents, our own ministers. They used them against us. That's why you see most African leaders live very, very, very exorbitant lifestyles. So I think this is the right time for us Africans to sit up and put in place the rightful leaders. I think that's the proposal I'm making. Choose the people that will lead with an African mindset and protecting all our raw material. And of course, providing business opportunities that are a win-win for both us and the West. I think that is those are the little things that we need to change in Africa. For the other issues that come up with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, that provides us with loans, and at the end, we are not able to pay back these loans, and then they take our raw material. Burkina Faso, I keep going back to Burkina Faso because they are a living example. Look at what the president did. He announced on the media that he has paid all their loans. He has refused his salary. He has cut down salaries of ministers, cut down salaries of directors, and every other sector, just for the interest of the masses, the people of Burkina Faso. So these are an example. These leaders are exemplary persons that we as Africans, we need to see their system of governance. Look at the mechanical development in Burkina Faso. They have materials that the cars, the cars for the military, the inputs for farming that they are bringing into their country. They are bringing it from Russia. They are bringing it from other Western country nations. But they are bringing these things in exchange of services, and they buy those things. They sell their raw material not like it was being sold before, where you sell something for $1 and the person takes it, produces that same thing and brings it and sells it back to you for $100. So where are we? We are working on the 1:100? No. I think this is the time our African leaders should be the pace setters. So it's all in the hands of our African leaders. And also our traditional rulers in Africa need to go back and relate more with their citizens than getting into politics. I think that is another aspect that has greatly affected our Pan-Africanism and making African real, because when once us traditional ruler, who are people that the people still believe in,
exactly. When
once we go into politics, we start turning our back from our people, and at the end of the day, you find yourself running away from your constituency because you can't serve two masters at a time. You can't be into politics and you can't be a traditional ruler where your people will trust you. And in the same culture, in the same village where you are a traditional ruler, you have, because we accepted politics, We accepted the Western form of governance in that same village where you are doing politics, and with multi-partism, you find people in your village who are opposing their traditional ruler because they belong to different political views, they have different political ideologies. So this now creates some conflict between leaders and their people. I'm talking about traditional rulers and their people. And I think in the early 40s and 50s, our traditional rulers insisted, when they were setting up the Norway's House of Funds, they insisted that traditional rulers should not get into politics. And I think that is one of the highest points that has affected our systems, has affected our African culture, and we are finding it difficult to bring it back. So it also starts from us traditionalists, and then it goes up the ladder to our ministers, to the president, and also the policies, government policies that have to rewind what we had lost earlier before. 50 years is just 50 years. We still have hundreds of years to live. And let's go back to our drawing board and live as we used to live during pre-colonization. Thank you.
Thank you too, Chief. But I was staying with you, given you mentioned a very pertinent point. Now, given Africa is on its way out of this, mental slavery, through some of the points which you've elaborated so far, what practical parameters could be put in place, for Africa to be able to scrap off this or deconstruct this issue, this mindset of not being enough to take the continent where it's supposed to be, this mindset of being dependent on external collaborators or external parties, and focus on the goal, focus on making Africa great, focus on actually making Africa first and not the center of it all.
Look at, we talked of governors, we talk of senior divisional officers who rule our people. Meanwhile, the same people have mayors, and then they have traditional rulers. A quick solution to this is for government to decentralize power and send it back to the traditional authorities to lead their people, because these are the people they believe in. These are the people they listen to. These are the people they trust. These are the people that are given to them by their ancestors to govern them. And these are the people who relate directly with their ancestors. So they should decentralize power, scrape off the governorship, scrape off the senior divisional officers who come and take our land and sell it back to us. Take our lands and sell it to foreigners. I think if government scrapes off that aspect of governance and allow the mayors who are directly voted by the people, and the people do through free and fair election, we'll be able to choose people that reside in our communities to sit in as administrative authorities through mayorship, who are people who master them. And then they should create structures in the course of having good governance and having the rightful leaders, the right president on seat, who decentralizes power and sends more of House of Mayors, House of Chiefs, and they relate directly with the central government. I don't see why this too much bottlenecks of different factions of power. You come right into a small city and you realize that there's a governor, there's a senior divisional officer, there's a divisional officer, there is a mayor, there is a government delegate, and who now takes care of all of this? The power tussle is too much. Delegates of town planning, delegate of urban development, delegate of sports and physical education. So the whole place is leadership. So how do we come out of this? Scrape off all of that, scrape it off, and allow power back to mayors, allow power back to the House of Chiefs, and refuse chiefs or traditional rulers from refuse them from taking positions into politics. They should stay and govern their people. I think that is what Africa needs now. And if we have the right leaders, they would be able to implement these policies, and Africa will be great again. Africa first. That's the new nomenclature, as Dr. FONGOD said a while ago.
Africa first, indeed. And I believe that Shitu Forowa could equally relate with that slogan. Shitu, now, in line with the ideology of Ubuntu, I am because you are, and you are because I am, Pan-Africanism is a recent trend in Africa. Like you mentioned in one of your responses, Africans should be able to think from an Afrocentric perspective. Now, how can Pan-Africanism within the context of the African continent serve as a tool to unify the continent of Africa and combat external control?
One of the things that Pan-Africanism would do is to have rooted concepts in the minds and hearts of the average African. Because one of the things that we must do is to do African-led researches that focus on our problem. Because most of the time, the problems of Africa can be solved by Africans, but we continue to wait for external, persons to give us a direction. External bodies, international organizations to say this is the way to go. But if we have in our institutional, parameters, we have African-led researchers. The African-led researchers will focus on our problems and give African solutions. So yes, if we believe in Africa first, then we must prioritize ourselves. For example, a lot of exports of our best hands is happening in our sports. You see some of the best, most talented players leaving the continent to play in international leagues. That's not a problem ordinarily. But when you need them to play at home to represent their countries, some of them begin to drag their feet. You talk about the quality of graduates from Africa that find that find jobs outside the continent. They become useful in a global space and less useful to the African, person. So we must look for ways to rechannel our resources, our, investment, whatever it is that will promote the continent. We need to find ways to retain it, on the continent, and that goes into both our legislation, like my co-panelist did mention. It goes into governance. It goes into education. It goes into the moral fabric of our societies. We must be able to say, whatever must happen to us first. But whatever we want to do, we must lead first, and others follow.
Exactly. If Africa needs to lead, it must lead first. Now, Dr. FONGOD, do you share some opinion as your co-panelist? And of course, just to add up to, what Shitu said, what role equally can, young Africans play in ending neocolonialism? And how can they be empowered, so to say, to take the lead as far as change is concerned?
A couple of maybe a year and a half to 2 years ago, I was in Ghana, and in my hotel room, I was flipping through channels looking for what I was going to watch, and I came across this particular channel, and I had two men absolutely animated. So they're speaking in, I think it was Twi or something like that. And so they were going on. I mean, totally animated. You think they were fighting. So I basically paused, trying to figure out what was going on, just for me to realize that they were actually commenting on Barcelona or some football stuff made out of Europe. And I told myself, I said, with that level of energy, Africa can be free. With that level of, just pure energy, just pure power, I saw within, the context of whatever they were saying, I think that the continent can be free. I'm quite hopeful. Why did I bring this whole in that concept of football? Europe is making tremendous amount of money on the African continent just in relationship to viewership and advertising, since the whole entire continent seems to be worshiping Euro football as if to say it's some kind of a deity. And yet the continent in itself is making no money from all the transmission that is coming out of Europe into Africa. What I propose is this. Many football fans will not like this, but if you are going to be able to save the continent and basically begins to find ways in which creative ways in which we can actually help begin to grow our own industries on the continent of Africa, why don't we tax the living daylight out of every transmission that is coming into the continent of Africa via satellite? Unfortunately, we don't even control the satellite, neither do we control the feed of the satellite that is basically coming into our territory. This in itself is just football. Do you know the amount of military satellites that are transmitting informations in and out of the continent of Africa? No, we don't. Do we have any idea as to how many base stations we have on the continent of Africa that most African countries do not even know actually do exist, and yet they are all being controlled and manipulated from the West? No, we don't. if most of the things that the West has done and Europe is doing on the continent of Africa, including the East, is doing on the continent of Africa, if anybody tried that in any of these first world nations, is going to be considered an act of war. So the notion, and you know, Chief said it brilliantly, that we are not saying that we are not trying to expect Europe from showing up on the continent of Africa. So far as I'm concerned, the idea of Western world from showing up in Africa, so far as I'm concerned, what I'm saying is this, that they are coming into the continent of Africa, and consistently what their mode of operation has been on the continent of Africa tantamounts to nothing else but terrorism. This is an act of war. Once you basically have something like the CFA, all right, which is basically being controlled and manipulated out of France, all right, you have about 12 different African nations, I don't know, 14 or 12 different African nations that has been locked into this madness, producing billions to France. All right. Meanwhile, folks are dying on the continent of Africa. If that's not terrorism, I don't know exactly what that is. We have to, at some particular point in time, call these things for what they are. The reality is that you know, we're not trying to save face. There's nothing to save here, man. It's been 60 years already. What are you trying to save? You grew up in oppression, and apparently it looks more like, if we are not careful, we'll meet our ancestors in oppression. All right, we have spent 60 years of this entire madness. We have talked about it, and the reality is we're not even permitted to say it the way we see it. If you try this nonsense in any developed nations, you'll be in jail. Unfortunately, it can't be done to the African, and it can be done on the African continent. And somewhat the same Africans will tell you, you can't say that because that's not who we are. Who are we as a people? Slaves? Who are we as a people? I mean, I'm wondering, is there any other way to define what we have been through? Is there any other thing worse than what we've been through? I think time has come for us to collectively begin to have the consciousness and the mind that to be free is not given, it's taken. To be free is not given, it's demanded. And that if you're going to demand freedom, you cannot demand freedom with an exception. Freedom is freedom. You cannot be shackled up with handcuffs in, you know, with your hands and feet, and you say, please just get the handcuffs out of my feet. You're still behind bars, you're still chained up. Freedom. And we talk about mental freedom. I think we have to basically maybe go back to people like Bob Marley. I think it says, emancipate yourself from mental freedom. It says, none others but ourselves can free our minds. None others but us can free our minds. And he says, have no fear for atomic energy. That means have no fear for the West. Have no fear for what the West can do. Have no fear for what the East can do. Because the reality is this, none of them can stop the time. The time here basically means God. None of them can stop exactly what is in God's agenda so far as humanity or the continent for that matter is concerned. So far as I'm concerned, to the Africans at home and those in the diaspora, if we're going to emancipate ourselves from the mental slavery of neocolonialism, we have to start thinking about this within the construct of what is it that we want as Africans, not what is it that we are told to want. My desire for freedom is not designed and orchestrated in the West. My desire for freedom is inborn, is enshrined in my ancestors, is on the shores of Africa and my culture, and is not outside of the continent of Africa. It's not offshore, it's onshore. We have to be free. And for us to be free, nobody will free us but ourselves.
Indeed, Africa has only want to free itself from, all this. And of course, I'm glad you mentioned that the diaspora do have a role to play because it cannot be underrepresented. Now, to wrap up today's conversation, I'll wrap up this this exchange with you, Chief MUSI. Now, to crown up the conversation, having heard what your co-panelists said so far, charting the way forward for Africa, what bold and immediate actions need to be taken into consideration? Or do African countries need to put first for Africa to be able to, reclaim its sovereignty, reclaim its own identity, and eliminate neocolonialism in this era, and it will be to do away with, mental slavery?
everywhere is America first, Africa first, Europe first, China first, you know. Let it all be first. Let everybody put itself, because if we say first, Africa first, and America says America first, you end up not having anyone to be second. So everybody will just be first. So yes, let's all go first, and then we get on the drawing board and then do business. Because if everybody understands where he is coming from and where he's going to, and then we can talk business, I think it's just the right thing to do. Africa first. We've seen it. Let's all go our way. Let's all take our different paths and see what we can do as business. Because it sickens my mind to think that our currency in Africa, in most of Central Africa, our currency is being produced somewhere else and sent to us. They determine our currency rate, they determine our economy, and they determine what we get. If they want us to have an inflation, they will have it. They want us to get bankruptcy, they'll get us bankrupt. So I think let's do the African first thing. I will be proud to travel across any African country without a visa. I will be a proud guy to sing an African national anthem. I will be a very proud person to have a head of state of Africa. And of course, we now believe in our cultural values. And with that, I bet you Africa will be great again. And Africa will remain first. And then we do business and we'll never have a second option. That's what I can say. And I think we can go by this. Let Africa be first.
Indeed, let Africa be first. Thank you, Chief MUSI, for your participation in today's edition of the program.
Thank you very much.
I call to say thank you to Dr. Stanley FONGOD for your immense, insight in making sure that we had a fruitful conversation.
Thank you very much, Sharon.
Meanwhile, I wouldn't forget Shito Forowa, who joined us all the way from Lagos. Thank you so much for participating in today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you for having me. It's beautiful.
Okay, gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Point. Dear audience, thank you for your immense attention. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And of course, like we mentioned, it is time for Africa to put itself first. You heard from the mouth of the panelists this day. And it's on that note I'll be saying that while we continue watching our programs on For You Media Africa, don't forget that Africa is first at all times. Bye-bye.
Hello, Chief. How are you doing, sir?